All right. I'm glad you all came back. Dave, is there a video first? There is no video first. You are going right into depression for us. By the way, there are a few people still out in the hall, but most of them are in this line for the bookstore because of your advertisement. So this really is your own doing, by the way.
Well, that's good. I'm glad. Books should be sold. Buy books, buy books, buy books. Including buy my books, but buy books.
And if you're really nice, you may get one of these.
I got 5 of them for my children's sermon Sunday already.
You did?
I did.
Children's sermon. Oh,
yeah, I got to give. It's my turn this week. I give them every 2 months. I give one of them, and it happens to be Pentecost. And she gave me those for my children's sermon.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool? I don't have to think now.
Yeah, that's always overrated anyway.
All right, everybody. I guess we're going to start. We canceled the video, or at least postponed it for another time. You all decided rather than being entertained by a video, you'd rather be depressed by me. So here we go. Depression time. Actually, I'm going to plug this real quick. One thing I didn't say at the end because of time. I've got a booklet called Priest of All Believers. It covers the pray, proclaim, sacrifice stuff, including some discussion questions. If you email me at ddaubert@day8strategies.com and ask for it, I'll sign you up for my blog and send you that at no charge. Normally I charge $15 for it, so it's a pretty good gift. And it's got a license with it, so if you get it, you can use it as a curriculum for your whole congregation. So it's got 4 times of discussion questions, things to read. You can make copies and pass it out. So if you're interested in that, email me at ddaubert@day8strategies.com, and I'll send it back to you, and you guys can start using it and talking about it, because you've got to change the conversation. There's other stuff at day8strategies.com also, if you're interested in any of the other books. A lot of my books aren't here because I self-publish. You can go to the Day8 Strategies, type in SA 2017. That says 2107. Don't type what it says, type what I say. 2017, SA 2017. I'll fix that later. And enter the coupon code, you get 20% off everything also. Enough on the sales. My wife always tells me, you didn't push hard enough to buy things. And that's how we eat. So it's time to be depressed. Everybody get in the right frame of mind. Okay, but don't write down SA 2107, right? SA 2017, not 2107. It's 2017, like the year. Synod Assembly 2017. This is how I write books, and then I have to go back and fix them. It's why it takes me so long. Everybody got it? Not yet, all right. Should have stuck this up during the break. If I'd been smarter. If I'd be smarter, we'd all be happier. It's the best I got to offer, I apologize. Are we good? 2017. 2017. Don't read what it says, read what I said. Not what I said, what I meant. You should read my mind. This is how my wife and I have to communicate too. So here's the deal. In order to reclaim all that good stuff we talked about, and let me tell you, if you don't think after what we talked about, whether you thought the presentation was good or bad, the stuff that's in it that we've got as Lutherans is decent, like life-changing, worth talking about, that there are people out there that would love to think, reflect, and live out of that kind of a mindset. And who doesn't want to grow up to be Helen? Oh my gosh. I would love to grow up to be Helen. And she was amazing, just amazing. A depth of faith and spiritual character and a love of neighbor, and deeply rooted in a Lutheran faith that had been with her since a child. But in order to become the kind of church that lives out of that, we actually have to stop being the kind of church we are in a number of ways. We just do. And it's just a reality. The world that we lived in when the church we have now was formed, it was a very, very different world. In the 50s and 60s, most Americans belonged to church. They didn't all care, by the way. It's a big myth that everybody was really serious and gung-ho about being Christians. People just went. First of all, we had blue laws. You wanted to leave the house and find an unlocked door? The church was the only place you could go. You know, there was all kinds of stuff. Plus, there was a baby boom going on, and so at least for like Lutherans, white babies were popping up everywhere. So we had all sorts of kids showing up, and we're a pretty white church. Maybe you haven't noticed, but we're pretty white. And the baby boom got us lots and lots more white people. It was a wonderful time to be the church because there was the Cold War and people were pressing on us to be godly Americans instead of godless commies. And church was a wonderful thing. And we were finally one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. And God, we trust, made it to the money in 1956. It was like an arrival moment for the church. And then the baby boom. How many of you have churches that built like educational wings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for like gazillions of kids? How many of them are still filled with gazillions of kids? Yeah. Oh my goodness. We got all these empty classrooms. My first church had a 550-seat sanctuary and 27 classrooms. 46 people attended on an average Sunday. We had 66 pews. I used to tell people, if you get bored during the sermon, just lay down. Nobody will notice. There's a pew for everybody, and we could bring 20 more people into sleep, and they could all nap during the sermon. Just wake them up in time for the bread so we let them know Jesus is here. So it was a very, very different world. Now, the reality is, as the world changed, the world that we've got now, only 12 to 14% of Americans actually attend church in a typical week. Isn't that amazing? About 1 out of 7. That includes Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, all the houses of worship stuff. Only about 12% of those people are Christian. The other 2 to 3% are other things. It means if you go to church on Sunday, you're not normal. Right? You're a little weird, let's be honest. If you're listening to some guy depress you in the afternoon on a Friday, you're just a whack job. I mean, you're just nuts. There's no sense that who is in this room that you're normal in the sense of typical. Normal people, they don't care about the church. They're not involved. They're certainly not going to synod assemblies, right? We have to own the fact that while when we grew up, going to church was normal, whether it was going well or not, it was normal. At least it was working for the church. You know, the supply and demand thing and the voluntary offering plates payment system was all balancing out pretty well. It's not anymore. And that to be a Christian means to be different, not to be the same. Got to own that. To be a Christian means to be different, not to be the same. And as long as we try to convince people, when I joined the church in college, because I didn't grow up in the church, I remember my friend Brian said, now that you're Christian, I suppose you're going to get all weird on us. And I remember telling him, no, I'm still the same old Dave. Because you can join the Lutheran church and not change. God loves you as you are, just forget about it. Right? Nobody ever told me about discipleship and transformation and the calling and all this stuff. I just joined the church because I was dating a Lutheran and I wanted her to like me. It worked. We got married. And 2 years later, we got divorced. I got married and divorced in college. But it's why I'm a Lutheran. And then I moved, and I got a job, and I met another woman. Her name's Marlene, and we married 34 years this year. And I met her at church. Yeah. And I told a similar story about this at one point in church. I happened to mention somewhere I was divorced or remarried, and a guy named Brad, who was divorced and was in our church for the first time, came to church, and he'd been looking and looking because he'd been kicked out of his church for getting divorced. He was no longer allowed to serve on council or teach Sunday school. Then he married a Catholic, and they wouldn't let him go to church and take communion. So they were looking for a church, and they came to ours, and I happened to mention this first Sunday that I was divorced, and they thought, wow, if the pastor can be this messed up and be up front, they'll probably let me come. And so Brad became a Lutheran, in part because he understood that you can actually not be perfect and still be loved, which is really the whole deal, isn't it? Now let's look at this kind of thing from the perspective of the bishop. Sometimes you need a bulldozer, right? I used to be an engineer for Caterpillar. I actually used to design parts for engines for these things back before I went to seminary. And bulldozers can do a lot of damage in a hurry. And very few of us want to take a bulldozer to our building, even if it would be beneficial if a lightning strike and a windstorm came through and nobody was there and it knocked it over. Most of us just don't have the guts to do it, or the heart, or anything else. Now, let's be honest, probably at least 2/3 of you are in buildings that are not an asset compared to the one. You would never build the building that you have today, right? You would love to get rid of those stairs. How many of you got stairs in your entrance? Yeah, that really works well with the American with Disabilities Act stuff, doesn't it? We could go down the list. How many of you still got single pane windows? Yeah, oh my. Yeah, no insulation in the sanctuary roof? Yeah, we got those. So none of us would build the buildings we have in many cases. But to take a bulldozer it's expensive, emotional, gut-wrenching. We keep them. So here's some sobering stats about our church. I started working at Churchwide in 2000. I worked there from 2000 to 2008. When I started at Churchwide, the Churchwide organization oversaw about 10,500 congregations. The ELCA at various times has been pushing up against 11,000 early in its time because of new starts and various things. Today we have 9,300 congregations. Average attendance when I started at Churchwide, 169. Today it's 103. Median attendance, that's the number where half our congregations have more and half our congregations have less. Median attendance when I started at Churchwide, 93. 67. How many of you go to a congregation that averages 68 or more in worship in a week? Raise your hands. You are in the top half of ELCA attendance. How many of you worship in between 67 and 100? That's 50 to the two-thirds. If you're at 100, two-thirds of our congregation's worship attendance is 100 or less. If you're in a congregation of 96 people on Sunday morning and you say, we're just a small church, that's not true. You are solidly in the top half of our church. Now, that's an empowering thing if you can get rid of it. We're just a small church, because anytime you say just to, that means don't have too high on expectations. We love to throw that in front. Oh, I'm just a small church. But if we can own that we're not just a small church, but actually in our church system we have some substance, some reality, then we can have some responsibility and some ability to do things. Our churches that are 67 or less are tenuous, aren't they? Full-time pastor, not very often. Pension and health insurance and all those things, gas bills, light bills, all kinds of stuff. A third of our congregation's worship attendance is 50 or less now. Lots and lots of small churches. So it's very tenuous, and it's projected as a result of this that congregations are going to merge, close along, and that by 2025, that's only 8 years away, we're going to be down to 7,800 congregations. We're going to lose another 1,600, 1,500 congregations over the next 8 years. 200 a year, give or take. Some of those are you. And any congregation under 100 is only 1 or 2 crises away from being there. It doesn't take much. We're very fragile. Now, in 2015, for the very first time in our history, worship attendance went under 1 million people nationwide in a typical week. We started out about 1.7 something million people when the LCA started per week, national attendance. 978,000 now. It's only about half of what it was when we started 30 years ago. Our church is about half as big on Sunday as it was 30 years ago. Only 30 years. We've lost half our church. 40% of our membership, 50% of our worship attenders. In other words, worship is declining faster than church membership. Part because we don't clean our rolls till they stop coming. We're behind. And these numbers are not as depressing as they could be because 20% of you don't fill out your parochial reports. And when you don't fill out your parochial report, if it went from 95 in worship to 92 in worship, we carry 95 across until you turn in a new report. So if a typical church is in decline and doesn't turn a report in, we maintain a status quo until you do, which means our real numbers are more depressing than our actual numbers that we've got on paper. Now, having said this, the other thing about the LCA is we're the whitest denomination in America. That's not hyperbole. That's actually true. We are the whitest denomination in America. PCUSA, United Church of Christ, go down the list. They're all more multicultural than we are. They're not like having a coup at multicultural success. We're just awful at it. We are the whitest church in America. Roughly 40% of America isn't white in a European sense. There's non-Hispanic whites, who are about 60% of the population. Hispanic whites and other ethnic groups make up about 40% of the population. By 2024, the American public will be about 50-50, changing radically. Under age 10, it's already 50-50. Our public schools nationwide, over 50-50 because white people keep opting into parochial schools so they can kind of keep living in the old world as long as possible. But that's the reality. Our church is really white in a world that's very diverse. 1 in 6 marriages today cross ethnic lines. When many of us were kids, a Catholic married a Protestant, and both families thought that both families had married down, right? Remember that? Huge controversy. 1 in 6 marriages is crossing ethnic lines now. My daughter's dating a guy. They're going to get married. They're not engaged because you have to get a ring to do that, and they can't afford that. So they're just going to get married, but his name's Ramirez. Very different world. Doesn't look like the 50s, but our church does. In part because almost everybody who goes to our church either was already here in the 50s or is related to somebody who was. Our ability to take in new people and really reach out has been very, very weak. Now, the reality is, this is actually a picture of Bishop Jim when he was younger. I believe it was taken during his candidacy interview at the Synod office. Now, the reality is congregations are shrinking, and they're the foundation of our church, which means synods, which derive everything as it moves its way through, and then church-wide organizations are all in this tenuous spot now, which means the entire ELCA is very fragile. It's an incredible ecosystem, but it's very fragile, and at every expression of the church, things are struggling or tight or anxious because of this reality. At the same time, every expression of our church has some really amazing things happen. There are incredibly vibrant and exciting congregations. And there are amazing things happening at synods. And there's incredible stuff happening at church-wide and even globally within Lutheranism. So it's not that we can't do amazing things because we see it and we're involved in it in so many ways. But in general, it's not the norm. The norm is status quo, and status quo is declining. So we know it's possible. Not just theoretically possible, that, gee, if we do something, maybe something will be different. We see it all over the place, pockets of all kinds of excitement in our church. You saw some of it when Linda shared some things about our church and some of the stuff that's happening. It's amazing. We've got a young woman in our church. She's 29 years old. She's going to spend the next year in Madagascar working in a deaf school. How cool is that? That would never be possible apart from this kind of incredible ecosystem, this web of stuff that we know to be the church, the Lutheran church. But the reality is that these examples are still exceptions rather than norms. The renewal of the church means that what's exceptional today becomes normal in 5 to 10 years. And that's about how long we have. What's normal today, what's exceptional today becomes normal in 5 to 10 years because that's how long we have. 10 years from now, the reality will have crushed us or will have made a new change. Are you depressed yet? But that's the truth. We do not have a lot of time. We're standing on the cusp, and I'll show you why in a minute. A moment, a serious moment of choice and decision about what kind of church we will be and how we will participate in God's future. Now, God's not waiting for us. The future's coming, the kingdom's coming. In Luther's catechism, he says, God's kingdom indeed comes without our prayer, because God is God. But we pray in this prayer that it might also come to us. We want to be part of it. We don't want to not be part of it. In fact, we're invited to be part of it. That's the most exciting thing about life, is to be invited into God's mission. But as a church collectively, we've probably got 5 to 10 years. We either make the move or history moves on. Now, here's the reality. The difference between these places is this basic truth that we started with. Do we own and excite ourselves about who we are and what God has given us as an identity, or does it remain a secret to even us? This backhanded compliment that Brian McLaren gave us, that we've got this incredible thing and it seems to be a secret even to ourselves. Either we rejoice and get excited about what we have, which is amazing, in which the world is hungry for, or we just wait it out. And God will do something else. It'll be cool. Don't worry. God's into the cool business. It's going to be fine. My friend Ruben Duran says, God's going to do what God's going to do. The question for us is, as Lutherans, do we want to be part of it or not? Now, having said that, the bishop this morning talked about centrifugal and centripetal force, this in or out thing. And centrifugal force pushes us out, and centripetal force pulls us in. And the tenet of the argument is that we're too inward focused. I sort of agree with the bishop, and I sort of disagree with the bishop. So I want you to think about this, and then we can have a little dialogue in the Q&A even. The reality is we are too inward focused. But the reality is it would be nice if in was God in Christ. That would be great. If Christ was at the center of our church and the focus was, I spend too much time hunkering down with Jesus, that's a problem we could probably work with a lot easier than the one we got. But the truth is, we do not hunker down with Jesus when we get together. Not really. We just hunker down. The Bears, the Cubs, the weather. We'll talk about anything. Be honest, last time you had church on Sunday morning, you had fellowships, coffee and donuts. How many of you are talking about Jesus? Not too much, huh? No, that's not what we talk about. Pastor already talked about Jesus. We already said the creed. I said Jesus. It was in a couple of the hymns, too. I'm sure it was in the hymns. Yeah. So we do the religious thing, and then we get together, and we're just social. If we're honest, we are more a social club than we want to admit. Now, we're a religious social club, and we've got Christian things, and we got teaching and a lot of stuff. But if we're not careful, we can easily convince ourselves that because we're religious, we've got a spiritual base that's strong. And there's more and more evidence in our society that people are not mixing the two up anymore. There's a lot of spiritual but not religious people. And there's a lot of religious but not spiritual people. And spiritually hungry people are not going to religious people to find out what's going on, because a lot of people say, yeah, that church, it's religious, but I don't think it has any spirit. They've stopped asking us the questions, not because they don't have the questions, but because they don't think we have the answers. We're too busy being religious or social to talk about the hungry stuff that they've got. So we gather around our history, our ethnicity, our geography. You can go down the list. And a lot of the reasons we are who we are because of our history. I was the pastor of Hilltop English Evangelical Lutheran Church, first church I had. Why was it that? Well, because the German church down the street was going to keep speaking German. Well, by the 80s when I got there, people thought you had to be of British descent to join the church. It was like an English society. Nobody had a clue why the church was English. The Lutherans did, but not the rest of the community. It was like a secret, but it was still very important to us. And all these things kind of identified who we were and who we weren't, but it also defined who we were and who wasn't allowed. We were a very respectable church. And when a lady named Orpy came in who was not respectable, one of our respectable greeters noticed Orpy come in and noticed that she wasn't respectable. She wasn't dressed properly. She was an Appalachian woman who'd moved into the city. And so she saw her and she said, radar up, not one of us. So she actually said, this is a respectable church. You might be more comfortable someplace else. That's my greeter, who had voted for a mission statement that I thought was a pretty good one. But deep down inside, it wasn't about what Jesus was up to. It was about who we were and who we weren't. It was mostly cultural garbage. Now, fortunately, Orphy said, F you, and walked in anyway. Really loud, by the way. Really loud. And comes over to me and said, do you know what that lady said? And I said, no, but I know what you said. But I understood that sometimes the Holy Spirit has to cuss to get into our churches. And it's Pentecost this Sunday, and we should be careful. Because the Holy Spirit's coming, and I don't know what it's going to say to get in. Now, having said this, I was the director of a program called the Transforming Leaders Initiative in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, a few years ago. And we studied some things using a Reveal resource that Willow Creek Association did and modified with us in the Episcopal Church to learn some things about how people in our churches function. And they have 4 categories, which were modified for us because they actually have a seeking mindset. So they thought exploring Christ was like seekers. But we found that 25% of our people were in the exploring Christ category, even though they'd been in our church 10 years or more. They weren't actually seekers, they just didn't believe it. They were actually functional agnostics. A quarter of all, it was over 1,200 Lutherans in 14 congregations. We surveyed them, a quarter of them tested out as functionally agnostic. I don't believe any of this garbage. This is silly. I don't even know if God exists. Why do you come? We got a good softball team. I like the guys. My grandfather built the altar. We've always come here. My wife makes me come. We've got a 7th grader. It's part of the deal. People come to church for lots of reasons. Some of them are Christian theologically based. A lot of them actually aren't. We found that about a quarter of our people coming to church 10 years or more in well-established, long-established congregations, a quarter of them didn't believe any of this. And they weren't seeking, they weren't curious about it, they just blown it off and decided that they were going to be religious anyway, because that's what you do there. The next group, growing in Christ, they kind of understood it, and they believed, this group was theistic, they believed in God. They believe Jesus died and rose from the dead, and some of the basic kind of creedal stuff, but they're kind of catechetical, so they were pretty much informational, but had a very strong sense that they had no idea what God was up to or if it had anything to do with their lives. So this was a group that could say, yeah, God exists, yeah, Jesus died, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. They could kind of answer the basic catechism questions, but if you said, what has it got to do with how you live your life on Tuesday? They were like deer in the headlights. Yeah, I believe in Jesus, but I have no idea why or what difference it makes. 47% of our people said, I believe this, but I have no idea why or what it matters. That's a lot of people. And again, the average person in this survey, 10 years or longer. It's not like these were all newbies. In 3 more weeks, they'll get it. No, we're talking people who spent decades in the church. 47% of our folks said, yeah, I know the story, and I think it's a good story. I believe it, but I have no idea what difference it makes. Now, this next group close to Christ actually believed that Christ was not only raised from the dead, but actually was alive. So they had some sense that there was an active God. This is an important threshold in terms of people's faith. Is God a historical truth and some objective information, or is God actually a lived reality? At this point, we moved to lived reality. This was a really important step in terms of understanding people's understanding of God. Is God a was or an is? These people have God as an is. Big difference now. Present tense. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. And the last group, Christ-centered. This is sacrificial discipleship. This is actually, they shape their lives. They make decisions based on this, and they're most involved in living this out. And they actually need the church the least. A lot of these people are cranky at their church because they keep getting the same old sermons over and over again for people that don't believe any of this or who don't get it. And there's no depth. So it's really hard if you're a mature Christian in an average congregation to figure out what to do. So we discovered that this 9% was the crabbiest of all the people about their church. They weren't necessarily crabby in a bad way, but you said, are you satisfied with your church? No, I don't get anything out of it anymore. We just keep doing it with the same thing over and over and over and over again. I still don't think anybody gets it. I'm just tired. I'd love to get fed with something meaningful, meaty. These people need spiritual direction, deep, small groups, other places to study, and sometimes they just needed to go off and find someplace else to learn, even if they were committed to their church as a resource, which many of them were. So in this study, 72% of our people, almost 3/4 of our people, either don't believe in God at all or have no idea why it matters. 72%. They love their church. They're very committed to it. Often they're wonderful people. It's not a condemnation, it's just a description of reality. And in many cases, it's not their fault. In many cases, it's not their fault. People eat what's put on their table. We do not feed deep. Willow Creek did a study of themselves, and they discovered that they found in their work that they were doing all kinds of stuff. Willow Creek's a really big church, and Lutherans love to pound on Willow Creek. And there are good reasons to pound on Willow Creek, theologically, for different things, and there are good reasons not to. But Willow Creek discovered that they were working really hard on stuff, getting people involved, and they were not creating disciples. So Bill Hybels, the pastor, got up at a leadership conference one year and said, I just want to thank you for coming back to this year's leadership conference because everything we taught you last year we think was wrong. That takes guts. Wow. And here's why. And he said, we've been making Christians, people coming left and right, but they are a mile wide and an inch deep. And Lutherans were really happy about this. Yeah, we've been telling you so. Those shallow entertainment churches, you know how that is, right? Yeah, mile wide, inch deep. Then we started doing this stuff in a Lutheran thing. You know what we found? We're an inch wide and an inch deep. We didn't do any better. The entire church, the entire premise of the church, whether you're a mega church or whether you're a Lutheran congregation from a long-standing rooted history for a couple hundred years in your place, the entire premise of the church in the United States needs to change. And it needs to change around discipleship and helping people own and root their faith in a living God who has died and rose again and is active and present in their world and calling them to missional involvement in the life of the world. That's a very different God than the one that ratified you 50 years ago and said you're an okay person because you're a godly American, not a godless commie. Just stay normal and everything will be fine. It's a very different world. So we've actually taught unintentionally that God is not active and present. That God is sort of an information thing, an object. God is watching us from a distance. Maybe you love that song, but it's not true. It's not true. God is close. God is intimate. God is incarnate. God is present. And we constantly keep this kind of theology of distance or almost deism with a little historical twist to it. Now, I wanted to talk about the Apostles' Creed. One of my pet peeves is the Apostles' Creed. Now, don't get me wrong, and don't say Dave Daubert said we should abandon the Apostles' Creed. He's not a confessional Lutheran anymore. But thinking the Apostles' Creed is a faithful witness and an important part of our tradition, and thinking we should teach people to recite it every week in worship are not the same thing. And I would like us to stop. I would like us to stop. I want you to think about how important it is to think about a God who's not here, who is a was, not an is, and then think about the creed. Jesus was conceived, was born, suffered, crucified, died, was buried, rose, descended. What do you hear? It's all past tense. Now, in black, we've got the only present tense word in the entire creed is seated someplace else. And then there's a future tense, will come sometime in the future. What do we teach people? Long, long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, Jesus was. Today, he's on his butt up in heaven doing nothing, watching. And someday, maybe he'll do something again sometime. In the meantime, you're on your own. Over and over and over, we say Jesus was. Jesus was. Would you recite it with me, please? Everybody, Jesus was, he was crucified. We do it every week, right? This is the place where we rehearse our faith. And we rehearse, it's all past tense. And then we wonder why people think it's all past tense. Well, they remember 85% of what they say and 12% of what they hear. What do we make them say? It's all past tense, it's all past tense, it's all past tense. Please believe it's true. Future, present. No, it's all past tense, it's all past tense. We're killing ourselves with our practice because we don't help people rehearse for life, we help them rehearse for a tradition that needs to continue to move on. Not because the creed's a bad creed, it's a wonderful creed. Not because it doesn't explicate incredibly important questions for the centuries in which it was articulated, but it is not the thing we need to say right now. Jesus is. Christ is alive. He wasn't just raised from the dead, he is risen from the dead. He wasn't just crucified and raised a long time ago, but he is present. He's in your face. In this bread, I tell you, Jesus is here. Go and be the hands, feet, and Christ now in today's life. Now, Luther understood this. Luther didn't know what to do about this, and he didn't have the freedom of technology and things at the level we have. But I want you to think about Luther's thing. This is Luther's explanation on the first article of the Creed. What is Luther trying to do? He got a God who created heaven and earth. Pretty quick, right? Boom. I believe that God made me and all creatures. And what does Luther do? He has given me my body, still takes care of him, gives me clothing, daily provides, defends me, protects me. What is he doing? Everything's present tense. Luther's saying, somehow we got to get out of this, God did this, and help people understand the presence and activity of God in the present tense. So Luther's entire catechism was constantly trying to take stuff that was and help people see how it is. This was the heart of Luther's teaching. Take people who know some little nothing, teach them something, and then teach them what it means in a present tense way so it actually impacts their lives. In response to this, I am to thank, praise, serve, and obey him. This is something about my life. You hear what Luther's doing? It's not just God made the world. God is providing, interceding, intervening, involved, providing for you, protecting you, daily involved in your life. If you don't get that, then Luther says you missed the whole point. The first article isn't about a God who made the world. It's about a God who created and is still creating. It's not about a God who was involved. It's about a God who is involved by God's very nature. Now, this is important because it affects how we speak as preachers, how we help people talk about each other and to each other, the kind of liturgical practices we put in place, what we actually recite and what we teach, because what we practice is what we do. And eventually, if we want people to talk about what God is and we only help them to think about what God was, they're not able. The disconnect is just too high. And nobody's going cold turkey on Tuesday at the water cooler with their friend thinking, oh, I got all these was's in my head, but I know there's an is in there somewhere. I'll just see what he thinks. We're all going to shut up and be quiet because nobody wants to look like an idiot with the most important thing in life. Your spirit, your soul, the sense of who God is and what you've been made for. So if this is going to happen, the renewal of the church is going to require us to really think about how we do the practice of worship, how we spend time together. Is really, really hard work. And not everybody's going to like it. And you don't have to agree with my ideas. The point of renewal isn't to do what Dave said, but to wrestle with what does it mean to make the living Christ living and present and visible and engage and embody that in your place and time rather than just continue to be church in the way we always have been. Now, having said this, we know from research in ELCA, and there's these vibrancy things that we're going to give. There's what are they called? Congregational vitality assessments. We're going to use these in the renewal process here, that these things have done a lot of different work, and they've looked at things in one of the building blocks. There are 2 building blocks for healthy congregations in their research. The first is awareness of a present and active God. You cannot renew a church if the people do not have a collective awareness of a present and active God. God cannot be a was. The gospel cannot be information. This has to be grounded in the incarnation is present in the midst of our lives. The reason we worship and eat this bread and drink this cup is because this is an is, and this is takes up our entire bodies and lives. We are part of what God is doing in the world. This is essential. If God is not present and active, the whole rest of it is just playing church. Now, the second thing is that this also tells us that, for the most part, if we're honest, we're spiritually immature. 72% of our folks don't get it. And to be honest, depending on the day, sometimes I might be one of them because it's not really like everybody lives in a category all the time. There are days when I'm just really convicted. And there are other days when I think, this is all just a bunch of hooey. I don't know why I'm wasting my life preaching. Now, fortunately, most days I get to preach. And by the end of preaching, I believe it again. It's an amazing thing. You know why? Because we remember 85% of what we say and 12% of what we hear. It is a real blessing. I'm serious. It is a blessing to be a pastor because I have to do what all of us are supposed to do. And if I don't, everybody's cranky. So I do it. But it is a blessing. If you're a preacher and you get to say Christ is alive and using us, and at the end of that you don't believe it, well, you're in the wrong work. But the reality is, a lot of times I don't always start with the same faith I finish with because saying it really matters. Everybody else gets to say was. I get 15 minutes to say is. What a blessing. Now, if we're going to find our way out, the other question is the other half. And this is where I think the bishop's out is right, because I think there's an in we got to do. The out is that we are inward focused, but we're more sociologically inward focused than we are spiritually inward focused. So we need to refocus what we're focused on in, but we need to be focused out. Most of us wish the neighbors would come. You probably all got a church sign out front, right? But if you're really up to date, how many of you got a website now? How many of it still has like last summer's VBS on it because you don't update it? Yeah. But we all do this. We all have ways that we want people to come and invite themselves. This is a particularly nice sign, waiting for a sign to visit this weekend. This is it. But what I really like about this one is there's no worship times. So unless you actually already know what's going on, this isn't really very helpful, is it? But this is it, waiting for a sign, come visit. But most of us have our worship times on there, and we really have a sense that we want to meet the neighbors, and the appropriate time for them to come would be Sunday morning at 8:30 and 10:45, or whatever it says on your sign, right? Because obviously meeting the neighbors would be a wonderful thing, and if they were good people, they'd show up, all right? We're waiting. How's that working for you? The neighbors coming kind of every week. The neighbors just streaming in. Hey, I wanted to meet you guys. I know you've been worshiping here for like 127 years. We haven't had a chance to talk, but I'd like to meet you. Of course not. They're just sitting there looking at the sign and going, what the? They don't even have a time. But we all feel better because it says visitors welcome, or we got a web page now. We're kind of with it. Maybe even a Facebook page and putting a few pictures on Instagram. Boy, the people are just flocking now. The reality is, we all want this. We feel good about it. And then we also want to make sure that there's a little bit of service, especially for our kids. I can't imagine how many times I hear somebody talk about a project and people get going and say, that's a really good idea. I bet the youth group would like to do that. It's amazing how many old people decide what youth groups want to do. And usually it's things they think is a good idea, but that they don't want to do. It's just an amazing thing. But we want a little service, especially for the youth. There's still 4 high school kids coming. We ought to have something for them to do. And we got the sign out. We're welcoming and friendly. And we don't actually have to test that because nobody comes to see if we're hospitable. But we said we were on the sign. So we've got this kind of outward wish, and that's where it stops. So I want you to all take out a piece of paper, or just in your mind here, I want you just to do this little test with me for a second. Every one of you attends or represents even here participation in some congregational life. You go to church there, you probably, if you were to visit some other church and some other synod on vacation, you'd go in, there'd be a little book and you'd sign your name and your address and your phone number. If it's kind of a with it thing, there might even be a column for your email address. And then there'd be a last column that would say home congregation. And you would say, I go to Zion Lutheran Church in Elgin, Illinois. That's what I would put, or whatever your home congregation. So we all call this our church home. A lot of us don't live next door to the church. We live maybe 18 miles away now. Used to live a few blocks, but things have changed and we've moved around. So a lot of us drive in from other places, and we don't really think about the neighborhood of our church as our neighbors. They just happen to live next door to the church. And the truth is, if this is your church home, then these are your neighbors. So I want you just in this thing, this X in the middle is your church building. It's your address. Every piece of property, no matter how it's structured, if it's a city lot, there's a street here, and there's 3 houses kind of across the street. There's a next-door neighbor on each side. There's somebody across the alley or behind you, and 2 other houses. If you're out in the country, the next-door neighbor might be a quarter mile down the road, half mile down the road. But every one of you have a church building, and there are 8 people or 8 families that live closest to that building, regardless of geography. I just want you now in your paper to write the name and 1 fact about each of the 8 families that live closest to your church. Do the best you can. I actually want you to try this. I'm serious. Write the name and 1 fact about in each of the 8 squares for the 8 neighbors next to the church where your church home is. Because these are your next door neighbors. And do the best you can. I'll give you just 1 minute. "30 seconds. "15 seconds. I know you're scrambling. You got a lot of data to write down here. All right. Let's just do a little test. There's no shame here because actually very few people do very well at this test, as you probably noticed when the chuckling went through the room. But how many of you were able to do 6 or more names and stories of people around your church? Okay, really just a very few, maybe half a dozen or so. How many of you could do 3 or more? Okay, a little better. How many couldn't do any? Okay, quite a few of you. Okay, that gives you just some kind of idea where we're at. Again, there's not really about shame because it's a reality. We just have to kind of own, and an exercise this kind of creates that kind of awkward awareness. Wow, I don't know the neighbors. We're neighborly, we're a welcoming, friendly church, but I don't even know the lady that lives next door to the church. I was working with a congregation in El Paso, Texas, and I began a process, and there'll be some of the kind of exercises we do when we do this renewal process. So we gave questions. We said, we just want you to go out and meet the neighbors and ask questions and listen. And you can't sell Jesus. You just got to go out and tell them you're from the church. That's all you can say. Don't tell them what time worships are and everything else. We're not going to turn this into a transaction. We just want you to listen. So they went next door or across the street at a pretty big lot. And on one side of the lot where there was quite a bit of grass, a lady lived, and she had lived there in the house for a few decades and was actually in that house before the congregation started. And when the mission pastor came, he knocked on the door, talked to her, and invited her to be part of the mission church, and she wasn't interested. So we put her in the no category. And for 34 years of that church's history, nobody from that congregation ever spoke to that woman again. When they went and knocked on the door, the lady almost had a heart attack, they said. She was shocked. And, wow, I can't believe you're here, she said. She actually said that. And they said, why? She said, well, they came here when they started that church, and I didn't go, so they've never spoken to me for 34 years. And they were stunned. And she had really internalized that this church didn't like her. And she had really internalized that she didn't like this church. It was all from 34 years of silence because nobody bothered to go to the neighbors and say, hi, we live next door. We worship here. We just want to know who you are and let you know if you need anything, we're next door. You need to borrow some flour or an egg? We got a kitchen. It's yours. Now, that's a very different way to be church than most of us do. And most of us, if we're honest, don't talk to the next door neighbors. We just keep hoping they'll keep introducing themselves. Jesus never said, wait here, and the people who are really interested in good and right just will come introduce themselves to you, and you'll have a church. It worked in the 50s. You could put up a sign and put certain things, and it would kind of happen because culture was pushing people. It's not there anymore. Jesus always said go. Jesus always sent. If anybody's going to meet the next door neighbor between your congregation and them, the onus is on you. If you don't know them, it's not their fault. It's on us. We've got to go outside. And the church and the world in which we live is about building relationships, building relationships, building relationships. If we're not building relationships in our community and we want people just as objects, I call them wallets with legs, people will come in and sit in our pews and be counted for attendance and put something in the plate, then our churches are gone. We can't wait for resources to come. We have to love people and go love people and simply love people and see what happens. And when you love people, God is always in the middle of it, and something happens. So that's really key. So here's the key things. First of all, when you go meet the neighbors, introduce yourself. Say, hi, my name's Dave. I'm from Zion next door. That's all you say. Don't say we have worship at 8:30 and 10:45, and we hope you'll come. You've immediately turned it from, I'm going to meet the neighbors, to a sales pitch, haven't you? 99% of the people who hear that sales pitch will not come to church next Sunday. So what you've done is immediately said, the first thing I'm going to do is create a failed transaction between me and my neighbor. I hope it works. Don't bother. Just go meet the neighbors. Go back again and again. Introduce yourself. Get to know. Ask them questions and listen. Find out what's going on in their lives, what they think about the community, what's good, who's doing neat things, what's an issue, what kind of things are they wrestling with, whatever. Just ask questions and listen. Be a sponge. Absorb everything that you can. As you hear things and find ways, be involved in any way that you can to make your neighborhood better. And in many cases, if you're like a typical congregation, many of us have 67 people or less on Sunday, remember, you're not going to be able to do this by yourself. You might have to build partnerships. As you meet people, build partnerships. I've got a label here that's Kids Hope USA. Our congregation started mentoring in the schools through an organization that organizes. Kids Hope is an organization that connects churches with public schools and does one-to-one mentoring in public schools using people who go to church. So in our congregation, we've got 14 people that go into the school across the street at Lowry School and do one-on-one mentoring. As a result of that, the school is our friend. Kelly O'Brien, the principal, who is retiring, has been an ally for the last 10 years. When we're having a big ice cream social, we put a little addition on our building with handicap accessibility. We're having an ice cream social and dedication. 480 invitations went out to those school kids in their backpacks, put in by the school. Because if you're friends with the school will be friends with you. It's not a religious service. It's an ice cream social for the community. The school can publicize it, and they will. If we'd asked that 10 years ago and said, hey, we're having an ice cream social, can we put these in the backpacks? You bet no. We know because we asked. Nope. But you build a relationship, and they trust you, and they say you're here to help, and they believe it. They want to help you back. It's an amazing thing to build relationships. And we could never have started a mentoring program had that kind of impact and that kind of relationships in the school with the kids and all kinds of things. We can invite them to Vacation Bible School now. We sent them 2 years in a row to Christian camp in the summertime. Recruited them at our book fair. Anybody who wants free Christian camp for a week in the summer, tell us and we'll make sure you go. That was all possible by building relationships and partnerships. Our little church could never have done that by itself. But as you build partnerships, your capacity grows. And you can do all kinds of things with resources that weren't there at the beginning. And finally, don't try to sell Jesus. Don't try to sell Jesus. Be Jesus. Proclaim the gospel whenever you get an opportunity and it's right. But just be the presence of Christ. Build relationships and let people know where you're from. And ultimately, invite them after you've built a relationship. Invite after. It might be the last thing you do is actually invite them to church. Not the first thing, the very last thing. But it changes a culture to say we just want to be neighbors, we want to be a helpful presence first, and out of that relationship to share the gospel and invite people in. If you start with inviting people, the evangelism thing, dead in the water, 99 out of 100 times. So the second building block that the ELCA has found in these congregational vitality assessments is that being a missional church, an outward-focused church, a church that sees God on the loose, at work in the world, and wants to do something about that, that kind of a church is a very different kind of a church. So building block number one, God is present and active. We believe it and understand it and incorporate that into our life together. Building block number two is the church is a missional presence. It joins with God at work in the world. Deep roots in, deep press sent out. And these two together, deep in, pressed out, this is how the church renews. In the end, we're centered in word and sacrament. This is really the hallmark of what it means for us to be church. We gather as a community, grounded and centered in Christ, a word and sacrament presence, and that pushes us in to support and nurture each other's faith and build disciples, and it presses us out to be the presence of Christ and missional presence in the community and the world. Deep, deep roots in word and sacrament, deep, deep roots in our community of faith to build and edify one another, deep, deep roots in the community to be the hands, voice of Christ out in the world. Christ at the center, deep community in, deep missional sense out. Now, in renewal, one of the things I think is very important, and Richard wanted me to talk about this a little bit, there is no substitute for hard work. I would love to tell you that if we do these 6 steps, and we will show you 6 steps, that in just doing these 6 steps, just kind of go through the motions and do these things, the congregations will renew. The reality is most congregations will not renew without really serious hard work, and probably a few fights along the way. There'll be angst, there'll be tension, there'll be conflict, there'll be struggle, there'll be all kinds of things. We're going to have to reconcile with each other once in a while because people are going to want to do something that other people simply don't want to do, and there's going to be a lot of kind of stuff going on. It is hard work to renew a congregation because it calls each of our own faith into some kind of question and calls us to renew and transform personally. Well, that's scary. And it requires a community of people to actually go through transformation together. You know, if I want to lose 10 pounds, which I'm not very good at, as you can tell, it's hard work. But imagine if I said we all need to lose 10 pounds and do it by the same date. And somebody says, well, actually, I'm anorexic. I need to gain 14 pounds. For serious, right? You start looking at the balances of needs and reality. And to just have a universal goal for a community is really hard work. So to go through personal transformation is hard. To get an entire community of faith to agree together, you got to really know this is important. You got to be willing to stake a lot on it. And you got to know that there's going to be some angst, some real angst along the way. So a lot of times I hear people say, well, renewal sounds like a good idea, but I don't know that we're ready for it yet. Well, remember, we got 5 to 10 years. I don't know how long you want to wait, but there ain't much left. I want to show you something. This is how aging impacts vitality. This is a little lesson I got from my dad. My dad retired when he was 52 years old. God bless him. And he's 76 today, so he's been retired for 24 years. And one of the things he said is when you retire at 52, all your friends are older than you are. I said, that's true if you're a pastor in the church too, actually. And he said, as a result of that, he's been able to watch his friends age. And he said, it's very interesting. He said, for the most part, as people age, they go through a fairly slow and steady period of decline, and it's almost on a day-to-day, week-to-week, even maybe year-to-year, indistinguishable. And he said in this period here where they might be physically a little slower, like if you took their 100-yard dash times or how far they could hit a golf ball, be a little slower, their experience of quality of life actually increases through here often. The kids are gone, empty nested, they can go on trips and vacations and travel when they couldn't back here when the kids were alive. And so for a pretty long period of time...
Are the kids still alive?
Oh, they're still alive. Yeah, they're just gone. They come for Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving every other year because they got, but no, they're still alive. Yeah, you can hopefully anyway. It's not always the case, and of course that's pretty sad. But at about 80, he said, everybody he knows starts to go through some pretty significant stuff. And a lot of people go 40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70, 70 to 80 even, Pretty vibrant, pretty healthy. But 70 to 80, most people who are 80 don't look close to that when they're 90. And a lot of his friends, he said, go through some pretty serious stuff and don't make it to 90, that this is a precipitous spot. What it means is you can go for a long time and not really notice much. Live in the illusion that everything's fine. So in the ELCA, let's say this is the year 2000. And our core membership in the ELCA in the year 2000, the average age of a Lutheran was in their mid to late 50s, like 56, 57. Okay? Pretty old based on the population, about 20 years older than the population. But 57 is pretty vibrant. It means most of your people in the church are working still. A lot of them in the younger half have kids in elementary school, especially junior high and high school. So you've got working families with children. And your church feels pretty good. You don't have a lot of people in their 20s and 30s, but maybe still some. But the core membership even still has kids. So in 2000, we're feeling okay. 5 years later, the core membership, I've moved these 5-year windows, and I've only moved the core membership 4 years at a time, because you pick up a few young people. So we're keeping the core membership actually is lagging slower, which is helpful. If it's actually matching, you're worse than this. But now the core membership in 2005, 5 years later, you still got some people in their 40s. You probably still got some junior high, high school kids and college kids. Your core membership is still early 60s, which means most people are still working. They got free time and they're traveling and doing some stuff. You're still feeling pretty vibrant. Everything's good. Not quite as many kids as we used to, but not none. Everything's okay. 2010. Now we're down to our youth group has 3 kids in it. And a few junior high, elementary kids straggling, a couple of young families. But our core membership now is 65. A lot of our folks are retired. Still very vibrant, healthy. In fact, early retirement is one of the most vibrant and exciting times for a church if people are finding things. They've stopped working perhaps at something they were ready to stop working at. They've got time to volunteer at a food pantry or a soup kettle or to start something. So we're actually gaining in many ways. Our congregation is actually gaining labor and feeling more vibrant perhaps than it's felt in a long time, because a lot of these early retirees now have time to do things that they didn't have time before. So we're still living in the illusion of vibrancy and excitement, but we're aging. In our core membership, there's people out here who are dying. We have funerals and things, but the core membership is still in this kind of range. But by 2015, this is what's been happening in the LCA. By 2015, a typical congregation's core membership now includes a fair number of people in their 80s. And that group of people now has more health issues. They're starting to be shut in, or they're moving to some other location to be closer to their children and grandchildren, or they're selling their house and moving into a retirement community, but it happens to be 14 miles away and they join another church, or. And at the bottom here, your youngest people in the core are now in their late 50s and early 60s. There's really almost no kids left, even college age. So a lot of our congregations now, still pretty vibrant, but they're right on the precipice. Some who are ahead of this are already falling off, and we're seeing this. This is part of why our worship attendance is dropping so quickly all of a sudden, because as they go to this piece, they go off the end. And by 2020, this is where we're at. A third of our people in our core membership are in their 80s in a lot of congregations, and they're struggling now. There's a lot of pastoral care needs. There's a lot of health issues. There's a declining number of people who can show up. Attendance is starting to drop. The older that we look, the less likely we are to keep those young families that happen to visit for whatever reason, because we had the sign out, because there's no other kids in our Sunday school, or we only offer it once in a while, or whatever that is. And by 2025, you can begin to see what our church looks like. This is the reality in which we live. We're aging. When Ken Inskeep, who's a key researcher in the church, did some stuff on the age of the church and things and talked about baby boomers and immigration and how we've got so many people from off the boats and through birth, he said in his talk, one of the things as Lutherans we just have to do if we're going to save the church is we've got to increase the birth rate. And H. George Anderson, who used to be bishop and had just a really good sense of humor, said, "Look around this room. It's too late." So if we don't change, this is what the bulk of our congregations will go through. Just a reality. We have 5 years. We have 5 years in many of our places. 10 years in a high percentage of our places. If you're a little behind this curve, it's still probably your curve. You just might be 5 or 10 years younger than it. You may have 15, 20, but not long. Most of us have 5. So the real question now for you is, are most of the people in your congregation over 50? Over 60? Typical Sunday school, do you have less than a dozen elementary kids present most weeks? Is your building getting old? Do you have really tight budgets and all you do is try to figure out how to do the basics? Keep things running. If those questions are yes, 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 and yes, or yes to even 2 or 3 of them, you've got a lot of issues. And most of our congregations, including the one that I'm serving, wrestle with some of these issues. It's not an easy path out. Having said that, we know that congregations that find a way out renew their sense of purpose. They discover a willingness to change. They develop leadership where clergy and lay people work together in a collegial fashion, and they reclaim the priesthood of all believers, that everybody's ministry is important and involved. And one of the reasons you come to church is to be equipped and motivated and sent to be the body of Christ when you leave. That where these things happen, congregations become much more engaging, much more vibrant. Purpose, willingness to change, leadership that's shared, and priesthood of all believers. Now, if you have purpose without willingness to change, you become cynical after a period of time because you just keep trying the same thing. It's never going to happen. If you have willingness to change without purpose, you just get chaos, which is sometimes better than nothing because sometimes you get lucky. But purpose with willingness to change allow us to begin to think about what it means to be church and to focus and renew it. Renewal requires us to focus on why we're doing what we do and how we do what we do and working to make it happen. Now, what our congregations are going to do about it in this synod is up to you, but the synod as a whole is working on this process, and we're putting together 6 events starting in September, and the focus of these is going to start with mission and putting God first. It's going to be Lutheran. We're going to begin to think about language and how we move from the language of was to is and how we can help people begin to talk about faith in the pews. We're going to begin learning and going and doing engagement of neighbors. We're going to begin thinking and talking about how we engage each other and engaging ourselves. We're going to work to put this together and actually implement plans and support. Now, it's not going to happen in a vacuum. One of the things that's going to happen is every partner is going to covenant, which means that we can go back and say, yeah, you said you would do this, and we're going to help you do it. Everybody's going to know what everybody's part is, because you can't renew a congregation alone. If you could, most of our congregations would have figured that out already. That's important. You cannot renew your congregation alone. If you could, you would have already. It's not that easy, and it's not something any one of us can do. It's something we're all in together. And so your lay leadership are going to covenant. Here's what we're going to do. Your pastor is going to covenant. Here's what we're going to do. Your coach, and every congregation will have a coach from outside your congregation. Your coach will say, here's what I'm going to do. And the synod staff, your synod people are going to say, here's what we're going to do. We're all in this together. Part of this is there's going to be coaching. 90% of all change happens because of accountable partners. Very few people change by themselves. My wife, who's working on losing some weight right now, goes to Curves. She's gone to Curves for 5 years. And she's gained weight and lost weight and gained weight and lost weight, like most of us. But she decided she was going to get focused, so she signed up for their coaching program. And so now she goes every other week. She has a meeting with a coach. She weighs in. They measure her. They weigh her, all these kind of things. She's lost 14 pounds. Why? Accountable partnership, coaching. Cost her extra money, but it's working. Rather than just do whatever, I'm going to do this and I'm going to have a partner. Someone's going to walk with me through this. If you're serious about real change, you'll get a partner. If you say, oh, I can do it by myself, then just don't kid yourself. You're not serious about change. It's really that simple. Now, having said that, I want to tell you 2 stories that remind us that change is hard. First one is inside. When I got to the congregation where I currently serve, we had 50, 60 people in worship, 24 on church council. That was kind of interesting. Used to joke that you had to be either on church council or married to somebody on council in order to come to church. But we now have 7 on church council and 100 in church, so we're doing better at both places. But having said that, one of the things, a guy named Sandy Mitchell, who was a pastor in Ohio, said, you don't have to pass the peace in the middle of the service. And he explained why, and of course, you go through church history and why the communion and word services come together and why it's there. There's a reason for it. But he said, we can do it other places. And he said, we do it at the end now. Go in peace, serve the Lord, thanks be to God. As you depart, greet one another with the peace of Christ. He said, and it creates interaction so that rather than people chit-chatting during the service, because half the people don't pass the peace anyway, they just start yakking. They pass the peace at the end, and then if they yak, we're hospitable. And so we did that. We switched it to the end of the service, and we passed the peace at the end, and lo and behold, we got friendlier. We did. Every visitor got greeted by somebody. It was a huge improvement. And we kept teaching why we do it, and how we do it, why we do it, and how we do it, how we do it, and why we do it, back and forth. Now, I mentioned something about it, and of course, one of the reasons it's in the service where it is it's a sign of making peace before communion, the reconciliation sign, which most of the time doesn't really matter to anybody in church because we haven't had a big fight, but it's still symbolic. So a lady named Sharon, who has a very strong high church Episcopal background, said, during Lent, I think we should pass the peace during the middle of the service. Okay. It's reconciliation before communion. It's a repentance season. Let's do it. So we said, okay. So middle of the service, peace of the Lord be with you, also with you. And we all passed the peace. And of course, we hadn't really had any new members yet. It had only been there a few months. And you don't get new members that easy. So everybody knew what to do. We were all passing the peace. People yacked and talked about the Cubs if they didn't want to pass the peace with more people. And then we eventually rounded them back up and had communion. At the end of the service, though, it was very interesting. Because since we were doing it the old way, the last line of the liturgy for most churches is nice sermon, pastor, right? Right? Go in peace, serve the Lord, thanks be to God. Then we all get in line and say nice sermon, pastor, as we greet the pastor at the door. That's actually a liturgical ritual. And a lot of people, they don't get to say nice sermon, pastor. Pastors, if you want to do something fun, just say, well, what did you like most about it? Throws them for a loop every time. Having said that, people would get in line to go greet me at the door, and they had this little tape in their head, because we've been doing this from April to Lent, so February. So we've been doing this for about 10 months. Long time, right? Long time. And they would go like this after service. They would go to do this, and then, we're not supposed to do that now. Literally, they would actually say that out loud. They would actually half shake hands. We already did that. And then they would go get in line and tell me I'd given a nice sermon. They were snoring through it, but it was a nice sermon because that's the ritual. So then after Lent is over, we go back and we start passing the peace at the end of the service. And everybody's kind of relieved because there's a lot of angst at the end of the service. This is pretty awkward, this kind of thing. So then I do something stupid. It's about November, and I talk about Advent's coming soon. And one tradition is that Advent is a little Lent. Anybody heard that tradition? A little Lent? Sharon says, well, then I think we should pass the peace in the middle of the service like you're supposed to. Okay. So we did. Middle of the service, people passed the peace and went back. At the end of the service, everybody still turned and shook hands. Peace be with you again. It had taken root and had changed, but it had taken a year and a half of every week, except for 6 weeks during one Lent, for people to move from this is what we do to actually internalizing it and feeling like it was us. If you think when you try something and people like it or don't like it, you've tested it, you're nuts. Nobody likes new things. They're going to tell you how awkward it felt and how much better it was in general the other way. 70% of people don't like change in their church the minute they walk in the door. That's the basic truth. So it's really hard work to stay the course. And all these internal practices of how we interact and relate to each other takes a long time and a lot of awkwardness and a lot of pastoral care and loving and reconciling and talking and sharing and praying and hugging to love people through this. Now, the second story is this. Change outside is hard too. You know where this is going, don't you? I was at St. Luke's Lutheran Church in a town in Illinois Wednesday. I've got a parking lot at my church. It's not very big, but the school across the street doesn't have one. It's the teacher's parking lot. It's the lot where the parents park to pick their kids up after school. It's been a great resource for ministry. When we have something like the ice cream social, we just stand out in the parking lot. The parents all come. We give them invitations, give them bubbles or things, and say, hey, we're doing this thing. Come Saturday and enjoy. So parking lots are a great resource. But a lot of parking lots, I find, are people fight. At St. Luke's, I mentioned this. I didn't know their story. It's always dangerous to tell stories when you see a resource and you don't know the history. So St. Luke's has a beautiful parking lot, and they're right next door to a big high school. And I'm thinking, what a great resource. All those kids who drive to school need a place to park. And they could park in your parking lot, and you could get to know them and talk to them. Well, it turns out I mentioned that, and they said, well, they used to, but we told them they couldn't anymore. Because sometimes we need it for funerals. Well, you got those daily at this point? There's only 50 of you left. I mean, seems like in a couple of months they could start using it again because you'll all be gone. And they had talked about it, but they said, well, what about the insurance? Everybody says this. I don't understand this, but one of the things about transforming the church, I'm just going to say it, it is not our job to protect insurance companies. It is insurance job to protect us. Say that with me. It is not our job to protect insurance companies. Come on. It is not our job to protect insurance companies. It is insurance companies' jobs to protect us. Now, this is really important because it doesn't mean we want to do stupid things where people are actually going to get hurt because we know we're idiots. But it does mean that intelligent use of our property is why we have insurance, right? If nobody shows up on your lot and you're paying insurance, then you're wasting a lot of money. Insurance is so you can do things, not so you won't. Imagine if this church said, well, we got 46 parking spots. We're going to put a number on each one. At the beginning of the year, we're going to tell students that they can get a parking permit. And they can park here, and they can park in spot number 3 if that's their number. And every week, we're going to go out once a week, and we're just going to go out at 2:45 when school gets out. We're going to wander out in the parking lot and talk to those kids when they pick up their cars. Once a month, we're going to have a pizza party, and we're going to start a youth group based on those kids. And if only 3 of those 46 kids come, then that's 3 kids that we got to talk to. And if there's a funeral, part of the contract is if there's a funeral, we'll put a note on your car the day before and a sign on the entry, please don't park here that day because we got a funeral. They'll work with you. Those kids will be thrilled to help you out if you help them out. You're going to get to know those kids. What could be better than a kid that comes to your building? Now, imagine if the kid comes to your building on Monday and you say, you're not welcome here. Don't trespass, that's my parking lot. Tuesday, you're not welcome here. Don't trespass, that's my parking lot. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon, but between 9 and 11 on Sunday morning, if you'd like to park here. We would love to have you come and be part of our high school Sunday school class. There are 2 other kids who come sometimes. So maybe you'll be here by yourself, or maybe there'll be somebody else, but between 9 and 11, you're welcome. Now, how many kids are going to believe or care that they're welcome between 9 and 11 if Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday afternoon they're trespassing? Because we want to protect insurance companies rather than live the gospel. But this is hard. The people at St. Luke's, when I mentioned this on their vision team, they actually broke out in a fight during my meeting. Just the possibility was enough to create it. Not a bad one. We worked through it. But there was real angst in that room from people who said, yes, but we can't do that. And other people said, I told you we were supposed to do that, you bunch of idiots. Well, that's not friendly chat, is it? Now we got to have a confessional and reconciliation. This is hard work. So I don't want to kid you that things inside or outside are easy or hard. But I do want to end with this statement, and I want you to say it with me. God's church does not have a mission. God's mission has a church. If you believe that, renewal's for you. Thanks for listening.